Trying to find my glasses. Okay. It's
All right, so we are live on Facebook. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to our speakers who are here to join us on this session on media bias. My name is Samia Hassan. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a quick land acknowledgement. The work of Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people. And we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. As I mentioned, today's session focuses on bias in the media. So in that case, we also extend solidarity to Indigenous communities in their calls to the federal government to provide funding to national broadcasters to reflect the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Indigenous people, and also their calls to Canadian journalism and media schools to require all students to learn about Indigenous people's history, treaties, and rights. So again, our conversation today will focus on how media, both traditional and social, work, and if and how bias is embedded in the media towards particular groups. We have two amazing experts, media experts here today. As our guests for our session, we have Fo Nieme and Andrew Cardozo. A quick bio of our guests before we start our conversation. Fo Nieme is the Executive Director of the Montreal-based Centre for Research Action on Race Relations. He also served as member of an advisory committee on multicultural liaison of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, on employment equity for Quebec Treasury Board, the Board of Directors of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, and the Quebec government's task force on racial profiling. Andrew Cardozo is the president of the Pearson Center for Progressive Policy, a progressive think tank, and is currently a columnist with the Ottawa-based Hill Times, and has been a columnist for the Toronto Star. He has been a commissioner at the broadcast regulator, the CRTC, where he championed diversity and equity in Canadian radio and television. He is currently a member of the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council. So if you're tuning in for the first time, just a reminder that this series is part of CASA's ongoing work with our anti-hate community leaders group. These sessions are now taking place every alternative Tuesday at 4 p.m. and are available to view on Facebook Live as well as YouTube. So we will begin. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to start right away. So maybe Andrew, you can tackle the first question. So how is the way that people consume news changing? And how does this influence people's perspectives and decision-making capacity?
Well, Samuel, first, thank you very much to CASA for hosting this series on anti-hate. It's awfully important and very timely. My thinking on this issue is that we are changing the way we consume media quite a bit. It's been changing over the last decade, and it's going to continue to change fairly fast. So the traditional media, that's newspapers, radio, and television, are being consumed by less and less people, and more people are getting their news from social media. Now, there's a fair bit of crossover because traditional media all have fairly active online platforms or properties, so they're trying to get into social media a lot. But I think increasingly people are getting their news online. They're not listening to radio as much, not listening to the the nightly news on television or reading the newspapers, and certainly not reading the hard copy newspaper. So they're reading the newspaper online. And what that all means is that we are tending to consume media that we agree with. So if you talk about bias in the media, we're actually reading or consuming our own bias a lot more. And we're as citizens, as people, we're sort of getting stuck in narrower and narrower communities of interest rather than hearing the other side. So I guess it's partly because there's so much media, but partly because the layout of it When you had a newspaper, you kind of opened this big thing and there were articles all over. You read the ones that popped out to you first, but you might take a look at somebody you didn't disagree with. We're doing less of that. And that's a real problem because we're understanding each other less. We read media or we consume media, we're watching media that reinforces our own bias. So if you're looking at the American conventions, people who were Democrats were watching it all last week, and people who are Republicans are watching it all this week, and they didn't watch each other's conventions that much. And I think that's not a good thing in the end. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Vo, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we're in the age of the internet and social media, and when we talk about the we have to define a little bit of who what we're talking about. I think there's a growing generational difference in how the media news media are being consumed. Consumer habits have changed substantially with the advance of, among other things, the smartphone and social media, which leads us to the question as to what kind of priorities, what kind of messages, what kind of filters the viewers or the listeners are using in order to receive, treat, process, and use this information, especially when information comes from so many sources around the globe, with so much fake news or even news designed to basically to mislead or to create further division. But I think my main point is that when we talk about the we have to be very conscious of who we're talking about, because I believe the recent studies have shown that the Generation X and the Generation Z, for example, Generation Y and Generation Z, among other groups, have very, very different patterns of media consumption. And that will create a lot of generational gaps in the way that we look at news, we make news, and we act on the information or the news information that is being circulated in social media as well as in traditional media. So in the final analysis, we have to look at who's producing the news, where the news come from, and who's also consuming the news information. Because this is the wonder of the multi-channel universe, and the smartphones and a new vehicle for information dissemination.
Thank you, Vo. So maybe you can take a stab at the next question here. So advocates have been raising concern about the way that most traditional media report on racialized communities, especially Black and Indigenous communities, with the use of negative language compared to non-racialized people. Do you believe that is the case? And why do you think that is?
Andrew?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of thoughts. One is I just want to comment one more comment on what folks said, and this is really important, is that in this online world, the sources are enormous, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate between what is legitimate and what's not. Back in the old days with the traditional media, you generally had newspapers and television stations had at some level the ability to corroborate what was being put out. It was certainly biased in various directions, but now with online media, there is no filter, and so you're getting a lot of stuff, and it's very easy for people to follow various podcasts or tweeters or people who just put out a lot of stuff and be quite convinced about them. But let me talk about more directly to your question, and I want to give you the example. On July the 2nd, there was an attack on Government House, on Rideau Hall, where the Governor General and the Prime Minister live. There was a guy who drove his truck through the front gates, a truck which had a number of guns in it, and he wanted to have a conversation with the Prime Minister. Now, here are a couple of headlines. Gun-toting soldier from Manitoba arrested after crashing gate at Rideau Hall. Another headline, man who allegedly crashed truck through Rideau Hall gates with 4 guns in is soldier troubled by COVID conspiracies. Now, you probably guessed he was a white guy. You have to sort of wonder if he was a Black man or a Muslim, would other words to describe him not have been used? You read the stories and you hear about him growing up on a farm, having a meat company, these very popular sausages in the north end of Winnipeg, et cetera, et cetera. It's a really interesting example. And then what happened is that it took quite a while for the police on the RCMP on the grounds to get a hold of him. And then they had a conversation with him for 1.5 hours before they arrested him. About the same time, there was a Muslim man in Mississauga who was shot within minutes, who was having a mental health situation. The police arrived, and literally there were scenes of police pointing guns at him and shooting him point blank. It highlights on the one hand the way police minority relations happened, but to me the coverage was interesting. It was all very positive about the way this guy was handled with white gloves, and some people were saying, "Hey, what would have happened if he was black or Muslim?" And my thought is that should really be the standard of how we treat people who seem to be having a mental health condition, and make that the standard of how we treat all people. But that sort of discussion doesn't happen. And another headline referred to him as a gate crasher. Now, gate crasher is somebody who comes to your party uninvited and wants to have some drinks and eat some food there with you. He's usually a friendly guy who just wants to get into the party. This guy didn't want to join a party. He came there with very different intentions. So it's really interesting to see the way words are used in media quite often.
Well, I would like to add to it, as we were talking earlier about in terms of representation in the media, in terms of how it's being portrayed, particularly when dealing with Black and Indigenous communities, and also in the Arab communities and Asian communities, the others in Canadian, traditional Canadian society and media. I think that it's not only a question of misrepresentation, but we have to, I think, characterize misrepresentation not only in terms of biased representation in terms of being actively portrayed or explicitly portrayed in a negative light, but often the Canadian polite way of misrepresentation is not to have them there at all. We don't see that many of that racial diversity visible in the media in terms of images, in terms of voices, and in terms of perspectives and opinions. That's very important. And when there, we talk a lot in terms, for example, news reporting, but to focus on a lot of newscasters and journalists, but increasingly we'll also look at in terms of news director and the columnists that also have a lot of influence in how information is circulated and shape public opinions and public policy. And the other issue of misrepresentation is often is not in words but in images. I believe that in recent months, a lot of Canadians have seen a very, very it's gentle and insidious but biased representation of Asian Canadians who are often portrayed in articles on COVID-19 when the article has nothing to do with Asian people. But you tend to see that pictorial representation of Asian people or Chinese people in many articles produced in Canada and elsewhere about COVID-19. And that subtle representation reinforces the stereotypical link of the coronavirus as being a Chinese virus. And that's why when we talk about misrepresentation or fair representation, it's not about what's there, but also about what's not there. And I think in Canada we have more of a problem of what's not there that deprives Canadians of a very, very full and complete view of Canada and of the world.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew and Fo. So somewhat related to the last question, and you both touched on it a little bit. So I want to talk about anti-Islamophobia a little bit. So advocates that are doing anti-Islamophobia work are very critical of how media portrays Muslims in their media. And particularly they say that there is a fear-mongering tactics that are used by media to fan the flames of Islamophobia. So both in traditional and on social media. What do you think about these critiques and how would you respond to them? So I guess I'll give Fo, do you want to start with that one first?
Well, I think in terms of the anti-Muslim Islamophobia in media representation, I think it has been documented quite thoroughly and also around the world actually. in many countries. It's not only in Western countries, but I think so right now we're talking a lot about the situation Muslims in Asia, for example, in Myanmar and China. And I think the perpetual, but there's somewhat of a shift in recent months, maybe because coronavirus upsets the world. We don't hear about the Muslim terrorists anymore. We don't see about the Muslim as a danger to public security or a threat to the, in this case, the North American fabric of social cohesion and traditional, quote unquote, traditional values anymore. Because I think there are people come to realize that in reality, the concerns are pretty much on kitchen table issues, bread and butter, and on also an issue of some economic survival in terms of health. And these are the issues that cut across ethnic, racial, and religious lines. But we still have to keep in mind that as long as we have, among other things, the underrepresentation of Muslim or Arabic journalists or newsmakers in traditional media in particular, we always run the risk of having biased representation. The second thing too about Islamophobia is that we also have, as in the global universe of globalization, sometimes some of the news programs are produced by countries and we're not sure where they come from, especially in the social media. And sometimes, we talk a lot about, for example, the Russian conspiracy to poison the presidential American in the United States. We also have to be a little bit more very critical as to where some of the representation of Muslim come from, the source of that information, as well as the subtle messages, what's read between the lines, the subtle messaging that is not sometimes obvious, but it's very subconscious. And that's the kind of thing that I think we need to pay attention to in the year 2020 and beyond.
Thank you, Fo. Andrew, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between, in terms of Islamophobia in the media. My sense is there's a difference between what's happening in traditional media and online media and social media. I think things are getting a bit better in traditional media. To Fo's point, you're beginning to see more Muslims who are playing a role in television, certainly, and so they're in a position where they can be a bit more sure about how issues are framed. But in social media, it's just it's an open season. To me, it's really a dangerous territory where you've got various kinds of movements, various kinds of very hardcore racist movements who are saying things with absolute impunity, and that's the reality of social media. Is people can say stuff with complete impunity and get away with it. Complete immunity. They impugn people with complete immunity. But part of what we need to do is tell the story better and louder in terms of Muslims in Canada. At the Pearson Center, we've been putting together lists of people from various communities who are making contributions. And for example, as we're doing this research, and we hope to have it out in a couple of months, there are 4 Muslims in Canada who have been presidents of universities. Now, this is a very exalted position in our society, being a president of a university, and most people wouldn't know that. There are a number of Muslims who are in the media, who are in the House of Commons, who've been in cabinets, and city politics, provincial politics across the country. Certainly, some of the public health officers. The public health officer of the province of Saskatchewan, for example, of other cities are Muslims. Indeed, throughout the medical system, among doctors, there's lots of Muslims. So I think part of it is we need to tell that story a bit louder and clearer, which I think stems the fear factor, because we're not seeing enough of that positive image coming out. There's a lot of story that can be told.
Great. So the next question is accountability. So how can people that are kind of taking in the news and the media hold media accountable when there is misuse of power? Are there bodies or individuals or regulatory systems in place for people to hold media accountable? Andrew, do you want to go with that one first?
Sure. I think, I mean, generally, and I want to say there are, but I'm a bit impatient about that, simply because, you think about the newspapers and television and radio, and there are bodies that do it, and sometimes they do it, and sometimes they take long. But to me, they're all becoming less relevant because of online media. So with regards to newspapers, You've got press councils, which most but not all newspapers are members of, and you can complain through them. There isn't a hard punishment for it, but newspapers usually don't like to be hauled up before a press council. And you've got something called the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council, CBSC. Remember those four letters, where you can make a complaint for television and radio. That's the CBSC. But I want to talk about a larger problem, and that's how we regard various communities in our society at large. To some extent, media is a reflection of the views held in the society. And we have to really go after changing public opinion. And I would suggest to you that we have to do it in a way that is effective and strong, but yet respectful. And that's not easy. There is a growing trend of what's called cancel culture. And I think sometimes it's really important to implement cancel culture, but I think we should use it sparingly, because there are a lot of people who are for the first time beginning to look at some of these issues. And what we want to do is give them space to talk and space to explore things, and use the wrong terms sometimes. But sometimes, people who really innocently use the wrong terminology get really beat out on the head, and you lose the ability to gain them and a lot of other people who think they're okay people. So I think we have to gain people's understanding about our diversity and about the realities of who we are and how various people are contributing to society, and how we're not terrorists and we're not leeches on the public system and all the rest of it. And we have to do that in a way that is respectful, that allows people to come in. And the one thing I'll just say, because I don't want to take too much time, but I went to the Black Lives Matter demonstration here in Ottawa, and it was, to me, one of the most positive or reassuring events I've been to. So you had an issue that was dealing about Black Lives Matter and Black people. I'd say 80 to 90% of the people there were white, and 80 to 90% of the people were young. That says to me that this issue for the first time has really caught on to the imagination of the wider population, who really understand how unfair this is. And so it has other replications for other communities as well. And the fact that they were young, to me, was really encouraging, because that talks about the future. That talks about, my sense is everybody who came to that demonstration who was young votes. And if they vote, then I think politicians will pay attention to them. So when you talk about the work that CASA does in terms of working with various government bodies in terms of changing laws, this to me is all positive. And so I'm sort of saying, when we look at how media reflects the diversity, really think about the public and trying to change public opinion.
Great, thank you. Fo, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that we have to be very, very vigilant and demanding as a society, as a democracy, because, on the one hand, we have seen where traditional media is concerned, a greater concentration of ownership. So with a greater concentration of ownership in the media, we have less diversity of voices and choices, and we also have less effective mechanism to ensure the high standards of broadcasting and media information, especially when the trend in the last 10 years has been towards devolving public responsibility for regulation of those standards to private sector or self-regulatory body. And I've come to become a very, very highly often suspicious of self-regulatory body when the industry dominates these self-regulatory agencies, and a public broadcast regulator or broadcaster such as a CRTC tends to basically vacate its regulatory and statutory body to ensure non-discrimination on the air. I think also, how do we regulate social media, especially with the growth of hate online based on race and gender and religion? I think, how do we work together to bring community, government, and industry together to develop a regulatory model that would be effective, that would be firm, and that upholds high standards of, among other things, non-discrimination in media communication information. And this is something that I think Canadians should pay attention to, because sometimes you feel that with the growth of the concentration of ownership, ordinary people are losing control and a say in the way that the media operate, and how our basically the social media world will eventually control our thinking without giving it that kind of space for a greater democratic traditions of, among other things, the oversight and of freedom.
Thank you,
Can I
Fo.
just add quickly,
Yeah, go
Samuel?
ahead.
I'm just with regard. I hear Fo's comments, and I know that he was a member of the CBSC and has and left it because of his frustrations, and I totally respect that. I'm still a member there. I actually chair the not. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Fo. I may be wrong, but I chair what's called the nominations committee of the CBSC. And I want to mention that because if anybody is interested in being part of it, please contact me at the Pearson Center. I'd be really glad to put forward more names of people who want to be part of that. Well, did
Thank
I
you.
misrepresent?
Well, I will reserve all comments on that because of the professional discretion, but I can say that I think it's a principle is that the people have to ensure that the industry self-regulation agencies work for the people and not for the industry.
Yeah.
Thank you for those
And
comments,
what
Fo.
CBSC tries to do is to have a balance of public and industry, but it's quite easy for it to be more industry dominated. Sorry, Sammy.
So last question before we run out of time. So just in terms of looking at what's coming out in the news, there's a lot of, as you know, Donald Trump has phrased it, unfortunately, we're using it as fake news. So there's a lot of fake news that's circulating online. So you brought up the pandemic and the result of the hate towards Asian communities and the fake news that's been circulating on social media as a result, and even in communication channels like WhatsApp and other forms of communication, there's just been so much hate spreading through the fake information. How can the public fact check on this fake news? Is there a role for the media to do fact checking? So as we know, recently in the United States, there have been CNN and Fox News that are doing a lot of fact checking on what Donald Trump says. Is there a similar role here for the media to fact check, or is there any other bodies or stakeholders that should be doing the fact checking?
Well, to be very brief, I think everybody should be involved in being very vigilant. And I mentioned earlier the need for higher degree of awareness, higher degree of the ability to deconstruct facts from quote unquote fake news. I think this is a democratic duty on the part of ordinary people, especially those of us who work daily in the areas, among the things that anti-discrimination. I think we also have to ensure that the social media world is also being subject to some sort of vigilance and oversight, because that's where the growth is in terms of media information dissemination, and that's where they're increasing the need for greater scrutiny and regulation of some kind to tackle the issue of online hate.
Yeah,
And
I'd agree. I think that while there is a role for media to be doing better, my message to people would be get out there and be part of social media. Use it for its advantage. There are lots of social movements who have used social media very effectively to advance their cause. And in terms of media coverage, anti-hate issues, I think you really want to encourage young people, since young people are active more on social media, to get out there and use it a lot. I would caution against doing too much of cancel culture but really getting out there and sharing the facts and the figures and talking about what people are doing and sometimes pointing out some of the subtle ways in which bias is carried out. So just quickly on this issue of the guy who tried to assassinate our prime minister at Rito Hall, some of the really, I think, very interesting commentary has been to really take on the media about the headlines they used. And I think that's one way of getting to the media and say, hey, you guys, seriously, you call this guy a gate crasher? Isn't he an assassin? Use the right terminology. So when those things happen, those are teachable moments. Never let them go by.
great. Thank you so much, Fo and Andrew, for joining us today. Any last words before we close the session?
Andrew, and I'll have just a short word
I
after.
I would say, I mean, just to carry on my point a little bit at the end, I think there's a real opportunity. People should really revel in the fact that social media is there. Use it as the fact that it is technically a democratizing tool. It does mean a lot of us have to be there. A lot of have to be, and I don't like to use this term, but on the barricades. But we have to be out there using it. And I think you can do a lot in terms of, and it comes back to the teachable moments. When people from certain communities do something interesting, everybody should get on that bandwagon and talk about that. But when powerful people misconstrue or misportray things, get on there and highlight it. There's no point talking about it in the coolness of time. When you feel like you've got the time, you've got to jump on there. There are teachable moments that come up all the time, which are worth using.
Great, thank you. Fo?
Yeah, quickly, information is a reflection of the state of our democracy and a state of our, among the things, the global capacity as well as domestic capacity to relate to one another and to continue to build, to evolve. I believe that everyone has that democratic citizenship right and duty to be informed, to inform himself and herself, and also to be a little bit more, shall we say, to raise the standards of democratic awareness and participation through media information, and therefore a part of the process and part of the challenge is to how to ensure that people always have a say in the shaping and the workings of the fourth or even the fifth estate, if we can call the social media as something beyond the fourth estate, because it's such a powerful tool right now to shape the world and the society in which we live.
Thank you so much, Fo and Andrew, for joining us today. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. We will be back in 2 weeks' time, right here on Tuesday, September 8th at 4 o'clock. And we'll continue to explore issues of hate and how to address them. Thank you, Fo and Andrew.